It begins in the biting cold of a Cleveland winter. On January the 10th, 1870, a 30-year-old businessman and his partners file a piece of paper that will change the world. They incorporate the Standard Oil Company. The initial investment is a staggering $1 million, a fortune in its day. But this is not just an investment, it is a declaration of war. Over the next 2 decades, this company will not merely grow, it will metastasize, it will devour its competition, buying up smaller oil companies and refineries across Ohio and beyond, one by one. By 1890, that $1 million gamble has exploded into a $100 million empire, a behemoth that controls over 90% of all oil flowing through the veins of the United States. The man at its center would become, for better or for worse, one of the most powerful and controversial figures in American history, a name that would become synonymous with both unimaginable wealth and ruthless ambition. His name, J.D. Rockefeller, and this is the story of how he became the world's first billionaire. To understand the man who would tame the chaotic world of oil, you must first understand the world that created him. John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in the quiet, rural town of Richford, New York. His family, the Rockefellers, had journeyed from the Rhine Valley of Germany to the New World nearly a century before, seeking opportunity on American soil. But opportunity meant different things to the two people who would shape John's life most profoundly. His father and his mother were two opposing forces, a clash of worlds living under one roof. His father was William Avery Rockefeller, better known as Bill. He was a man of boundless charm and zero conscience. A traveling salesman with a glib tongue and an easy smile, he called himself a botanic physician. It was a fancy title for a con artist. In his mother's garden, he would mix common herbs into concoctions, bottle them, and sell them as miracle cures for everything from cancer to cowardice. In the untamed landscape of early 19th century America, these quack doctors were a plague upon the desperate. Bill Rockefeller wasn't just a quack, he was an all-around predator. The money he made from his fake medicines was not enough. He loaned it out to poor farmers at crushing interest rates, waiting like a vulture for the moment they couldn't pay so he could seize their land. He was an unscrupulous character, a man who would later face court summons for sexual assault and gun violence. He was a force of nature, driven by pure, unapologetic greed. Then there was John's mother, Eliza Davison. In late 1836, Bill's travels brought him near Richford, where he met Eliza and swept her off her feet with his wild tales and confident swagger. They married in February 1837. Bill conveniently failed to mention he was already engaged to another woman, Nancy Brown. Eliza came from good stock. Her father, John Davison, was a prosperous farmer, a stern Scots-Irish man who was immediately suspicious of Bill Rockefeller. He saw Bill for what he was, a charlatan looking to get his hands on the family's money. In a cruel twist of irony, Eliza's own mother had died years earlier after taking a pill sold by a man just like Bill, a traveling doctor peddling false hope. Her father's warnings went unheeded. Eliza was in love. Her new life began with a shocking discovery. After moving in with her husband, she found herself sharing a roof not just with him, but with his housekeeper, Nancy Brown, the woman he was supposed to have left behind. It quickly became clear that Nancy's duties were far more than professional. Within 2 years, Bill Rockefeller, a man of prodigious and chaotic appetites, had fathered 4 children. 2 with his wife, Eliza, a daughter, Lucy, and a son, John, the future oil magnate, and 2 with his mistress, Nancy. In this impossibly complicated household, Eliza, a devout and deeply religious woman, somehow found a way to endure. She pitied Nancy. The 2 women, bound by their shared connection to an errant and often absent man, maintained a cordial peace. But the Davison family's patience eventually ran out. They forced Bill to send Nancy and her 2 daughters away. With them gone, Eliza gave birth to another son, William Jr. Bill's business kept him away for months at a time, leaving Eliza to manage the household on her own. She ran a tight ship, instilling in her children the values of frugality, hard work, and deep, unshakable faith. When John was 3, the family moved to Moravia, closer to the Davison farm, a source of stability in their turbulent lives. Here, more children arrived, Mary Ann, and then twins, Frank and Francis, though Francis would tragically die before her 2nd birthday. For a time in the 1840s, despite his dark side, Bill Rockefeller achieved a veneer of respectability in Moravia. He even helped finance the local school, but he considered farm work beneath him. That burden fell to his 2 eldest sons, John and William Jr. They were given adult responsibilities at a shockingly young age, a common reality in the 19th century, forcing them to mature far beyond their years. John attended the school his father helped build. He was not a brilliant student, but something stood out. A quiet, almost preternatural gift for mental arithmetic. He could see numbers, understand them, manipulate them in his head with an ease that baffled others. He was an introverted boy, serious and reserved. He lacked the boisterous energy of his peers, but he possessed something far more powerful: patience. When playing chess or checkers, he would drive his opponents mad, sitting in absolute stillness, contemplating every possible move before acting. This habit of cool, deliberate reflection was a gift from his mother. She had learned, through the painful consequences of her own impulsive marriage, the value of thinking before you leap. From her, John also inherited his faith. The local Baptist church became his sanctuary, a place of order and moral clarity that stood in stark contrast to the chaos of his home life. This deep faith would become a guiding principle for the rest of his life, sitting uneasily alongside the ruthless business lessons he was learning from his father. And those lessons were beginning to take root. The 1840s were a time of explosive growth in America, a nation pushing westward, energized by an entrepreneurial spirit. That same spirit was awakening in young John D. Rockefeller. At just 7 years old, he found a nest of wild turkey chicks. He raised them, cared for them, and sold them for a profit. He would buy candy in bulk from the store, carefully divide it into smaller portions, and sell it to his own siblings. Every penny was accounted for. This early drive was a distorted reflection of his father's influence. As a child, John idolized Bill. He saw a strong, exciting man who would take his boys hunting and fishing, who would fill the house with music from his violin. When Bill returned from his long trips, the anxiety of his absence would vanish, replaced by a flood of lavish gifts and wads of cash, earned through means both fair and foul. It was a powerful lesson. Risk brought reward. Bill had legitimate businesses too, like a lumber operation. He taught John how to judge the quality of wood, how to negotiate aggressively, how to exploit a customer's ignorance. But he also taught him to pay his workers well and his debts on time. It was a strange mix of shrewdness and responsibility, a code of conduct John would internalize and refine. He would later build an empire on these very principles, but he would learn to wrap them in a cloak of respectability his father never could. He would avoid the scandals that always seemed to follow Bill Rockefeller. That reckoning came in 1849. When Bill was indicted for sexual assault, the family's time in Moravia came to an abrupt end. He fled, and in the spring of 1850, he moved his family to Owego, a town near the Pennsylvania border. It was likely here, in the shadow of his father's disgrace, that the boy's idolization finally shattered. John began to see his father not as a hero, but for what he was. In his mind, his mother was now a widow. In his adult life, he would almost never speak of his father again. In 1852, John and his brother enrolled in the prestigious Owego Academy. He dreamed of attending university, but just a few months later, Bill uprooted them once more, dragging the family further west to Strongsville, Ohio. The ground beneath John's feet was constantly shifting. In the autumn of 1850, the Rockefeller boys resumed their education in the burgeoning city of Cleveland. America was a nation on the verge of tearing itself apart over the question of slavery. In his school essays, John wrote as a passionate abolitionist, a cause championed by the new Republican Party. He became close friends with a boy named Mark Hanna, who would one day become one of the most powerful political bosses in the country. John's future seemed bright. He was on track for university, but in May 1855, just on the eve of his graduation, his father reappeared with a stunning demand. John was to drop out of school immediately and find a job. The reason was, as always, rooted in Bill's deception. For years, his traveling doctor act had taken him across the border into Canada. There, in 1852, he had met and fallen for a 17-year-old girl named Margaret Allen. He courted her, charmed her, and conveniently forgot to mention he had a wife and 5 children back in Ohio. In June 1855, William Rockefeller, a man already married, committed bigamy. The reality quickly set in. He could not afford to support 2 families. The burden, he decided, would fall on his eldest son. After a brief 3-month course at a commercial college, John began his hunt for work. With the same methodical patience he applied to a game of checkers, he made a list of every respectable business in Cleveland. He visited them all, one by one, asking if they needed a bookkeeper. Weeks turned into a month. Nothing. His father, ever the opportunist, made a suggestion that filled John with dread. He could always join him on the road, roaming the country as a peddler of fake cures. The appalling prospect of becoming his father lit a fire in him. He refused to fail. He kept knocking on doors. And then, on September the 26th, 1855, the small merchant firm of Hewitt and Tuttle gave him a chance. They hired him as an assistant bookkeeper. For the rest of his long life, John D. Rockefeller would celebrate September 26th not as his birthday, but as Job Day. It was the day his life truly began. The teenager threw himself into the work with a religious fervor. He arrived at the office at 6:30 in the morning and often didn't leave until 10 at night. He dissected every bill, every invoice, accounting for every single cent. His job was not just to record the numbers, but to understand them, to protect his employers from being swindled. It was his first taste of financial command, and he loved it. Upon starting the job, he bought a small red notebook. He called it Ledger A. In its pages, he began meticulously tracking his own income and expenses, and the ledger reveals something extraordinary. From the very first dollar he earned, Rockefeller started giving money away. He made regular donations to his Baptist church, to black churches, and even helped purchase the freedom of 2 enslaved people. By 1859, he was tithing, giving away a full 10% of his income, a practice he would maintain for the rest of his life. He found no contradiction between his hunger for wealth and his devotion to God. In fact, as he grew richer, he would come to believe that God wanted him to be rich. Meanwhile, his father, Bill, despite his chaotic life, was also making good money. In a rare display of family unity, he decided to build a large house in downtown Cleveland. While Bill provided the funds, he left 18-year-old John in charge of supervising the entire project. From hiring contractors to paying the bills, John's success in managing the complex task seems to have convinced his father of something. The boy was now a man, capable of heading the family. And so, with the house complete, Bill Rockefeller essentially vanished, leaving to live permanently with his second wife. He had detached himself from his first family just as his son was about to embark on a journey that would make him the richest man in the world. Had he known the scale of the fortune to come, Bill would doubtlessly have stayed, looking for his share. At work, Rockefeller's talent was undeniable. When a junior partner left the firm, He was promoted to chief bookkeeper, but his new salary, $500 a year, was a fraction of the $2,000 his predecessor had earned. Rockefeller felt the sting of the injustice. When his request for a raise to a mere $800 was denied, he made a decision. He would no longer work for other men. In April 1858, he joined forces with an English friend, Morris B. Clark, to form their own trading house. Each partner needed to invest $2,000. Rockefeller had painstakingly saved half the sum. For the other half, he was forced to turn to the one man he knew would extract his pound of flesh, his father. Bill loaned him the $1,000, but at a punishing 10% interest. It was one last bitter lesson in business. The new venture was an immediate success. Clark and Rockefeller netted $4,400 in its first year and a stunning $17,000 in its second. But the commodities trade was volatile. Rockefeller, with an appetite for high-stakes risk that unsettled his more conservative partner, was constantly seeking loans to finance bigger deals. This set him at odds with Clark. Tensions grew, yet a new opportunity was bubbling up from the earth, an opportunity that would soon make their trading business seem like child's play. A thick, black substance was being discovered in the fields of Pennsylvania. They called it rock oil, and it was about to change everything. Rockefeller's timing was not just good, it was perfect. He was a man of his moment, stepping onto the stage just as the United States was transforming itself. The nation was a powder keg of potential, and the fuse had just been lit. The country was surging westward, energized by the California gold rush and the vast territories won in the Mexican-American War. Millions of people, fleeing overpopulation and poverty in Europe, were pouring into the country, providing a massive new labor force and an ever-expanding market. The US population was exploding from 23 million in 1850 to over 75 million by the turn of the century. It was a nation being built in real time, and that nation was industrializing at a breakneck pace. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in Britain, now took hold in America with ferocious intensity. All of this expansion, all of this construction, all of this work needed to be fueled. It needed to be lit. And it was all being connected by a revolutionary technology, the railroad, a spider's web of iron stretching from coast to coast. Like all men who achieve extraordinary success, Rockefeller worked relentlessly and seized the opportunities presented to him. But one must never discount the role of sheer dumb luck. He was the right man, in the right place, at the exact right time. In November 1860, a 21-year-old Rockefeller cast his first presidential ballot for Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's victory and his opposition to the expansion of slavery fractured the nation. In April 1861, the Civil War erupted. While Rockefeller would later claim he wanted to serve the Union cause, he made a calculated choice. His younger brother Frank would enlist and be wounded twice, but John and his brother William would pay $300 each for substitutes to fight in their place. It was a common practice, but it was a clear statement of priorities. Rockefeller believed his duty was to his family and, more importantly, to his business. For him, the war was not a moral crusade. It was the ultimate market disruption. And where there was disruption, there was profit. The war crippled north-south trade, forcing commerce onto the east-west routes that ran directly through Cleveland. Rockefeller and his partners profited handsomely. With the capital earned from the war-fueled boom, Rockefeller now turned his gaze to the nascent oil industry. For decades, the world had been lit by whale oil, but the great whales were dwindling and the price was soaring. A new source of light was needed. The answer was found in the backwoods of Pennsylvania, where the native Seneca people had long used a black rock oil that seeped from the ground for medicinal purposes. In 1853, a lawyer named George Bissell saw its potential. He commissioned a study from a distinguished Yale scientist, Benjamin Silliman, whose report confirmed that this rock oil, petroleum, could be refined into a remarkable illuminant. The only problem was how to get it out of the ground in massive quantities. After seeing brine wells used for salt extraction, Bissell had an idea. Why not drill for oil? He sent a man named Edwin Drake to Titusville, Pennsylvania. For months, Drake drilled, facing failure after failure. The locals called him crazy. Then in August 1859, it happened. He struck oil. The world's first commercial oil well roared to life, and the great Pennsylvania oil rush began. It was a frenzy. The area was instantly teeming with prospectors, speculators, and dreamers, all seeking to make a fortune from the black gold beneath their feet. In Cleveland, Rockefeller and Clark began handling small shipments of this crude oil in 1860. It was just another commodity. But then a man named Samuel Andrews, a brilliant chemist, approached them. He had a plan for a new, more efficient oil refinery. Rockefeller, the patient strategist, was instantly captivated. Clark, the cautious conservative, was skeptical. It was too risky, too new, but Rockefeller pushed. In 1863, the partners joined with Andrews and two of Clark's brothers to form Andrews, Clark & Company. Their refinery, the Excelsior Oil Works, was strategically built right next to the new railroad connecting Cleveland to the Pennsylvania oil fields. And in its very first year of operation, the profits from this sideline refinery business were already greater than their entire commodities trade. Rockefeller knew he had found his destiny. His improving financial prospects gave him the confidence to secure his personal life. He began courting Laura Celestia Spellman, an intelligent, devout, and sharp-minded woman he had first met in high school. Laura came from one of Cleveland's wealthier families and had a commercial mind of her own. She was his equal, a partner in every sense. They married in September 1864. She would become his most trusted advisor, the one person whose judgment he valued above all others. Over the next decade, they would build a family, with a son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., born in 1874, destined to one day inherit his father's empire. Back at the refinery, the tension between the partners was reaching a breaking point. While others saw oil as a get-rich-quick scheme, Rockefeller had a long-term vision. He believed the market would only get bigger, and he proposed borrowing heavily to finance a massive, aggressive expansion. The cautious Clark brothers were horrified. They used their majority ownership to vote him down again and again. In January 1865, Rockefeller laid out his most ambitious expansion plan yet. The Clarks threatened to dissolve the partnership entirely. To their astonishment, Rockefeller calmly agreed. He called their bluff. They decided to settle it the only way businessmen could. They would auction the company between themselves. The winner would take all. The Clarks thought they had him trapped. But Rockefeller had been quietly meeting with bankers for weeks. He had secured a line of credit they knew nothing about. The bidding began in a quiet room. The starting price was just $500. It jumped to $5,000, then $10,000. $30,000, the price shot past $60,000, then crept towards $70,000. For a moment, even Rockefeller felt a flicker of doubt. He was pushing his financial limits to the absolute edge. Morris Clark made his final move. He bid $72,000. The room was silent. Everything hung in the balance. Rockefeller looked at his rival. Without a moment's hesitation, his voice cool and steady, he responded, $72,500. Clark was stunned. He threw his hands up. "The business is yours," he said. That extra $500 was not just a bid, it was the declaration of a new king. On February the 15th, 1865, the 25-year-old John D. Rockefeller, now senior partner of the newly christened Rockefeller and Andrews, walked out of that room as the master of the largest refinery in Cleveland. A few weeks later, the Civil War came to an end. The nation rejoiced. a joy cut short by the assassination of President Lincoln. But with peace came a new reality. The war had been a clash of two Americas, the industrial North versus the agrarian South. The North had won. Industrial capitalism had triumphed. An Ohio congressman, James Garfield, prophetically remarked, "Oil, not cotton, is king now," and John D. Rockefeller had just seized the throne. The oil industry was still in its infancy, a chaotic and dangerous world of wild speculation. Accidents and explosions were common. Fortunes were made and lost in the blink of an eye. But John D. Rockefeller was not a speculator. He was a builder, and he saw opportunity where others saw only chaos. In December 1865, he established a second, even larger refinery in Cleveland, the Standard Works, and placed his brother William in charge. The name was a promise, a standard quality, a standard of reliability in an unreliable business. The company became a model of ruthless efficiency. While other refiners discarded waste products, Rockefeller sold them: paraffin wax, lubricating oils, petroleum jelly. Nothing was wasted. Profits were found in every drop. He built his own barrel-making plants to slash costs. He built his own shipping facilities. He bought his own railroad cars. He was controlling every step of the process, strangling his expenses until he could offer a product cheaper than anyone else. American oil was now flooding the international market, and William Rockefeller established an office in New York City, forging crucial relationships with the Wall Street bankers who fueled the nation's growth. Rockefeller borrowed heavily, but he built a reputation as solid as steel by always paying his debts on time. Bankers trusted him. They knew his money was safe, and they were willing to give him more, especially when crises struck that would bankrupt his rivals. But to achieve his grand vision, Rockefeller needed more than just capital. He needed a partner who shared his ambition and understood the brutal chess game of commerce. He found that man in Henry Flagler, 9 years older than Rockefeller. Flagler was another transplant from New York to Ohio, a sharp and sophisticated grain merchant. The two men were perfectly matched. Rockefeller was the quiet, calculating visionary. Flagler was the bold, brilliant negotiator. They sat at desks facing each other, working so seamlessly they seemed to share a single mind. They would even edit each other's letters, passing them to the ever-watchful Laura Rockefeller for a final opinion before sending them out. With Flagler came his stepbrother, Stephen Harkness, one of Cleveland's richest men, who invested $100,000. The partnership of Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler was born. A powerhouse had been forged. Flagler was immediately put in charge of the company's most significant cost: transportation. The railroads held the lifeblood of the oil industry in their hands, and they knew it. But the railroads were also at war with each other. The Pennsylvania Railroad was trying to lure business away from the Erie and New York Central railroads by offering low rates. It was a knife fight, and Flagler saw a way to use their rivalry to his advantage. He approached the railroads with an audacious proposal. In exchange for a massive secret discount, a rebate of up to 75% on shipping costs, he would guarantee an unheard of volume of shipments, 60 carloads of oil every single day. There was just one problem. The Rockefeller refineries, as large as they were, couldn't produce that much oil on their own, so Rockefeller did something both ingenious and utterly ruthless. He went to his rival refiners in Cleveland and offered to handle their shipping for them. He would pool their oil with his to meet the 60 carload quota. In doing so, he secured a transportation rate so low that he could undersell every single one of his competitors, the very competitors whose oil he was using to get the deal. They had no idea that they were helping to finance their own destruction. The deal was so significant that it got the attention of the richest man in America, the 74-year-old titan of industry, Cornelius the Commodore Vanderbilt, owner of the New York Central Railroad. When Vanderbilt requested a meeting, Rockefeller, with calculated audacity, replied that he was simply too busy to travel to New York. So the Commodore came to him The aging king of the railroad age traveled to Cleveland to sit in the office of the 29-year-old upstart who was mastering a new one. It was a tectonic shift in the landscape of American power. The Lakeshore deal, as it became known, was a death blow to the competition. By 1869, the Rockefeller partnership was the largest refiner on the planet, producing 1,500 barrels a day, a full 10% of the entire global output. The profits from this dominance allowed John and Laura to move to a brick house on Euclid Avenue, a street nicknamed Millionaire's Row for the grand mansions of the newly rich. Yet the Rockefeller house was famously modest. John disliked ostentatious displays of wealth. Religion, not riches, remained the center of the family's life. The children were taught to be self-sufficient, to keep detailed accounts of their chores and earnings, with no sense of their father's ever-increasing fortune. But a storm was brewing. The lure of black gold had attracted too many players. By 1870, so many refineries had sprung up that the supply of kerosene was 3 times that of demand. The price plummeted, erasing profits for nearly everyone. The industry was on the verge of collapse, threatening to kill itself with cutthroat competition. Rockefeller looked upon this chaos with disdain. He believed the market was unsustainable, being ruined by ruinous, cutthroat competition. He resolved to bring order. He envisioned a vast network of companies, all operating under a central authority, benefiting from massive economies of scale to control costs, supply, and price. It would be an arrangement, he argued, that would benefit everyone. Customers would get stable, lower prices, and the industry would remain profitable. To realize this monumental vision, he needed more capital than any partnership could provide. Flagler suggested the solution: incorporate the company. In January 1870, the partnership was dissolved and reborn as the Standard Oil Company. Rockefeller was president, his brother William was vice president, and Flagler was secretary and treasurer. They aligned their interests with investors by taking no salary, relying instead on dividend payments and the rising value of their shares. And even as the oil industry bled money in 1870, one of its worst years ever, Standard Oil paid its shareholders an unbelievable 105% dividend. The next year, as prices continued to fall, leaving competitors on the brink of bankruptcy, Standard still paid a 40% dividend. Anticipating further chaos, in January 1872, Standard Oil raised another $2.5 million in capital, creating a massive war chest. With this weapon in hand, Rockefeller was no longer content to simply outcompete his rivals. He was ready to bring them to their knees. While he was preparing his assault, the railroads themselves were plotting. Late in 1871, the Pennsylvania, Erie, and New York Central Railroads approached Rockefeller with a secret alliance. They would double freight prices for everyone overnight, while offering generous rebates to a select few powerful refiners, including Standard Oil, who would form a secret cartel, the deceptively named South Improvement Company. Standard Oil would act as the enforcer, guaranteeing traffic quotas between the 3 rail lines. It was a conspiracy to control the entire industry, but before the plan could be implemented, news of the secret deal leaked. The oil regions erupted in fury. Producers went on strike. It was a disaster for Standard Oil's operations. Rockefeller's response was not to retreat, but to attack with overwhelming force. If cooperation wouldn't work, he would achieve domination. He decided to buy out his Cleveland rivals, all of them, and consolidate his power once and for all. What followed, in the 3 short months between December 1871 and March 1872, would go down in history as the Cleveland Massacre. Rockefeller began by targeting his strongest competitors first, knowing their fall would create a panic. His main target was Clark and Payne, whose largest shareholder was Colonel Oliver Payne, a man Rockefeller had known since high school. When Payne asked to see Standard's books, he was staggered by their profitability. He saw the writing on the wall. He sold, And in a testament to Rockefeller's pragmatism, Payne soon became a trusted and valued executive within the Standard Oil empire. One by one, the others followed. 22 of his 26 rivals in Cleveland sold out to Standard Oil. The press vilified Rockefeller, accusing him of crushing his rivals and buying their assets for a fraction of their true value. He bought many inefficient refineries simply to shut them down, to choke off market supply. Mansions on Euclid Avenue went up for sale as broken men nursed a bitter resentment against him for the rest of their lives. Rockefeller, however, saw himself differently. Years later, he would justify his actions with religious imagery. He claimed he was a savior, a modern-day Noah, offering his competitors a chance to climb aboard the Standard Oil ark before the flood of competition swept them all away. By the end of the massacre, Standard Oil had the capacity to refine 10,000 barrels a day, a quarter of the entire world's output. The first stage of his plan was complete. He was now the undisputed master of Cleveland, but Cleveland was not enough. His sights were now set on Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York. His sights were set on America. Rockefeller first had tried cooperation. His attempt to create a voluntary association of refiners, the Pittsburgh Plan, had collapsed under the weight of greed and distrust, as smaller players cheated on their production quotas to chase short-term profits. The lesson was burned into his mind. You could not trust men to cooperate. You could only command them. Order would not be negotiated, it would be imposed. Then, in 1873, the world handed him a gift, wrapped in disaster. A financial crisis known as the Panic of 1873 rippled out from Vienna and New York, plunging the global economy into a brutal 6-year depression. Businesses failed, banks collapsed, crude oil prices plummeted to under 50 cents a barrel. While others drowned, Rockefeller saw the storm as his cover. His company, lean and efficient, remained profitable even while running only a fraction of its refineries. His war chest was full. His competitors were bleeding out. The time to strike had come. His gaze turned to Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, the other great refining centers. He deployed the same methodical playbook he had perfected in Cleveland. In the autumn of 1874, he and Flagler met with Charles Lockhart and William G. Worden, the kings of the Pittsburgh and Philadelphia refining scenes. After hours of talks, Worden remained unconvinced, so Rockefeller made him the same offer he had made to Colonel Payne: come to Cleveland, see my books. Worden took the trip. He looked at Standard's accounts, at the meticulous details of their costs and profits. The realization dawned on him with sickening clarity. Standard Oil could sell kerosene for a profit at a price below his own cost of production. He could not compete. It was impossible. He and Lockhart agreed to join forces with Rockefeller. The deal sent a shockwave through the industry. Within 2 years, only a single independent refinery remained in Pittsburgh, where 22 had once stood. They had been absorbed, one by one, into the growing Standard Empire. His conquest continued in New York, where he acquired the massive Charles Pratt and Company. This time, however, the deal was kept secret. Rockefeller was learning. He recognized it was better to give the illusion of a competitive market to avoid a political backlash. Many smaller refiners were bought out under the condition of silence, their former owners staying on as managers, their businesses now secretly controlled by Standard Oil. In the process, many of his harshest critics became his most loyal converts. The most prominent was a fiery 27-year-old named John D. Archbold, who had been one of the loudest opponents of the South Improvement Company's scheme. But Archbold, like Worden, saw the futility of fighting the machine. He joined Standard Oil, and his aggressive energy made him one of Rockefeller's most valuable lieutenants. Rockefeller even created a front company, the Acme Oil Company, with Archbold as its president, to serve as a vehicle for acquiring more refineries in secret. He was turning his loudest critic into his loyal soldier. He was the master of the refineries. Now, he had to permanently tame their masters, the railroads. His deepest conflict was with the colossal Pennsylvania Railroad, the largest corporation in the world at the time. When the Pennsylvania Railroad set up its own pipeline and refinery subsidiary, the Empire Transportation Company, Rockefeller saw it as a declaration of war. He fought back with his signature weapon, price. He diverted all his oil shipments to the rival Erie and New York Central lines, starving the Pennsylvania of its most profitable traffic. The financial blow was catastrophic. The Pennsylvania Railroad was forced to fire hundreds of workers, triggering a violent and bloody strike. The president of the railroad, Tom Scott, a titan used to getting his way, was forced to surrender. He offered to sell all of Empire Transportation's assets to Standard Oil. The price was $3.4 million, and Rockefeller, magnanimous in victory, accepted. He had brought the most powerful corporation on earth to its knees. He was now in control of the spigot. By 1879, he controlled almost the entire pipeline system in the country. He controlled over 90% of America's refining capacity. He controlled the railroads. He had brought order to the chaos. He was the undisputed, absolute king. But just as his victory seemed total, a new threat emerged. A group of defiant producers in Titusville, led by a man named Byron Benson, formed the Tidewater Pipeline Company. Their plan was audacious: to build a 100-mile-long pipeline, an artery of oil that would stretch over the Allegheny Mountains to a railhead in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, completely bypassing Rockefeller's network. It was the one thing he didn't control. Standard Oil scrambled to kill the project. They bought up tracts of land to block the pipeline's path. Company officials bribed state legislators to vote down bills that would grant the pipeline right of way. It was a vicious, dirty fight, but despite their efforts, in May 1879, the Tidewater pipeline was completed. Oil began to flow. It was a small leak in his perfectly sealed system, but Rockefeller knew that even the smallest leak could eventually sink the greatest ship. The war for control was not over. It had simply shifted underground. As Rockefeller fought to consolidate his power, the world he sought to control was itself changing. The railway boom was reaching its peak. The ever-growing population demanded more, consumed more. And then, in September 1882, a switch was flipped at the Pearl Street station in Manhattan. Thomas Edison began the electrification of America. One might think this would be a death knell for a company built on selling oil for lamps. But as one market was threatened, another was about to be born. Electrification would see a slow decline in the need for kerosene for lighting. But that decline was more than offset by the immense, thirsty new appetite of the industrial world. And on the horizon, a new invention was taking shape: the automobile. In the 1900s, Henry Ford's Model T would appear, fueled by gasoline, a once worthless byproduct of kerosene refining. The age of illumination was ending. The age of petroleum was just beginning. And Standard Oil would be there to fuel it all. The stage was set for John D. Rockefeller to become not just the richest man in America, but the richest man the modern world had ever known. But first, he had to deal with the Tidewater pipeline. And more worryingly, he and 8 of his colleagues had just been indicted by the state of Pennsylvania for conspiring to monopolize the oil business. The world Rockefeller had built was now beginning to fight back. This was the moment the legend of Rockefeller truly began, built on ruthless efficiency and brutal conquest. It's a turning point that still sparks fierce debate. Was he a predator destroying livelihoods for his own gain, or a visionary bringing necessary order to a chaotic industry? We want to know what you think. Drop your opinion in the comments below. And if you're finding this story of ambition and power compelling, take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the figures who shaped our world. Now, back to the conquest. The Pennsylvania indictment was a warning shot. The world was changing. The freewheeling, unregulated capitalism that had allowed Rockefeller to build his empire was facing a new and powerful enemy: public opinion. The press portrayed him as a predator, a spider at the center of a vast web, strangling competition. The whispers of monopoly were growing into a roar. Sensing the shifting political winds, Rockefeller made a strategic retreat. He announced an end to the secret railroad rebates that had given him his crucial advantage. The cases against Standard Oil were quietly dropped. It was a tactical sacrifice. The Hepburn Committee of the New York State Assembly soon declared such rebates unlawful anyway. The intervention came too late for his competitors. Standard Oil had already used the rebates to achieve a dominant position that was now nearly unassailable. Having neutralized the legal threat, he turned his full attention back to the renegade Tidewater pipeline. He prepared for another brutal war of attrition. But Rockefeller soon discovered something about his opponent, Byron Benson. Like so many before him, Benson ultimately preferred the guaranteed profits of cooperation to the bloody uncertainty of competition. The two parties came to the table. In 1882, Rockefeller's associates acquired a minority stake in Tidewater, just enough to strike a favorable market-sharing agreement. The leak was sealed. The rebellion was over. By his early 40s, Rockefeller was one of the richest men in the country, and he was becoming one of the most notorious. In a rare interview, he defended his sprawling enterprise. With a business so large, he argued, it was inevitable for malpractice to occur without his knowledge, but he promised to intervene as soon as he was made aware. It was a deft deflection. While it was true the empire was becoming difficult to control, Rockefeller often used his subordinates to do the dirty work, creating a plausible deniability that shielded him from direct blame. The sheer complexity of his creation was becoming a legal nightmare. Many states forbade companies from owning stock in companies across state lines, forcing the Standard Oil empire to exist as a tangled web of 41 separate, semi-independent entities. It was inefficient and legally vulnerable. His lawyers devised an ingenious and revolutionary solution. In 1882, they created the Standard Oil Trust. It was a landmark moment in corporate history. The stockholders of the 41 disparate companies turned over their shares to 9 trustees, including Rockefeller. In exchange, they received trust certificates that paid them dividends based on the profits of the entire consolidated enterprise. In one move, they had created a single, monolithic entity, centrally managed by Rockefeller and his inner circle, while navigating the letter of the law. The arrangement was so innovative that other industries, from sugar to whiskey, soon followed suit. The word trust would become synonymous with monopoly power, and the Standard Oil Trust was the blueprint for them all. The center of gravity for this new empire was shifting east. In 1884, Rockefeller moved his family from Cleveland to New York City. The following year, company headquarters was formally transferred to a grand 10-story building at 26 Broadway in Manhattan. It would become the most famous business address in America, a symbol of immense power and wealth. Yet, even in the nation's bustling economic capital, Rockefeller maintained his intensely private life. His social activities were limited almost exclusively to the Fifth Avenue Baptist Church. As his fame and infamy grew, he was flooded with letters begging for money. He was concerned about urban poverty, but he was wary of creating dependency. He insisted on value for his money, treating his charity like a business investment. He favored educational institutions, especially those that supported women and African Americans who were denied opportunities elsewhere. He began supporting a small, struggling college for black women in Atlanta, Georgia. In 1882, it was renamed Spelman Seminary, later Spelman College, in honor of his wife Laura and her family, who donated alongside him. In 1889, he pledged $600,000 for the establishment of a major new institution, the University of Chicago. It was the beginning of one of the greatest philanthropic acts in history. Like other titans of the Gilded Age, such as his rival Andrew Carnegie, Rockefeller was beginning the process of giving away the fortune he had so ruthlessly accumulated. By delegating day-to-day operations to a powerful executive committee, which he rarely attended, Rockefeller freed up more time. In 1887, he took his first trip overseas, a 3-month holiday with his family in Europe. He was now an international figure. He witnessed Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee parade in London and reluctantly agreed to an audience with Pope Leo XIII in Rome, a political move to please Standard's Catholic employees. But the trip was also a business reconnaissance mission. He observed his international competitors up close. In Russia, oil discovered near the Caspian Sea had been cornered by the Nobel brothers. In Paris, the powerful Rothschild banking family was building refineries to process Russian crude. In the Dutch East Indies, a new company called Royal Dutch was being formed. And in London, a merchant named Marcus Samuel was setting up what would become the Shell Transport and Trading Company. The world was catching up. Rockefeller responded by establishing Standard's own marketing offices across Europe, fighting for market share with the same intensity he had shown in America. Even as foreign competition grew, his control of the American market seemed absolute. Standard had revolutionized distribution, using its vast pipeline network and fleet of tank wagons to sell directly to customers, controlling prices by managing the flow of oil. They had even created the oil futures market, issuing certificates against the oil in their pipelines that could be bought and sold like stock. But the ground was shifting beneath his feet. He had defeated his business rivals. Now, a new set of opponents were rising to challenge him: journalists, politicians, and the American people. In 1892, following the death of railroad tycoon Jay Gould, the 53-year-old John D. Rockefeller officially became the richest man in the world, with a fortune approaching $100 million. He was now the primary target of reformers who contrasted the obscene wealth of industrialists with the poverty of the workers who fueled their factories. A journalist named Henry Demarest Lloyd had been publishing scathing articles, using leaked information from former Standard men to expose the company's secret deals and strong-arm tactics. Then, in 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, a vaguely worded but powerful new law designed to outlaw monopolistic behavior. 2 years later, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil of Ohio must leave the trust. Rockefeller's lawyers simply maneuvered around the ruling, transforming Standard Oil of New Jersey, chartered under more lenient state laws, into a holding company that would own the stock of all the other companies. The trust was dead. Long live the holding company. He was still playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. He even clashed with steel tycoon Andrew Carnegie, forcing the only man who could rival his power to buy his iron ore mines, in exchange for a promise not to enter the steel business, but the pressure was taking its toll. In 1893, he bought a vast country estate, Pocantico Hills, north of New York City, as a retreat from the world. His health was beginning to fail. He developed alopecia, a rare disease that caused his hair to fall out, depriving him of his signature bushy moustache and forcing him to wear wigs for the rest of his life. By the mid-1890s, he had stepped back from daily operations at 26 Broadway, leaving the fiery John Archbold in charge. He retained the title of president and his massive 30% stake, but he was slowly receding into the shadows, relying on his son, John Jr., to be his eyes and ears inside the company. In 1896, his old school friend Mark Hanna managed William McKinley's successful presidential campaign, to which Rockefeller had donated generously. With a pro-business Republican in the White House, his interests seemed secure. He devoted more time to philanthropy, establishing the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in 1901. But then, in September 1901, an assassin's bullet killed President McKinley. His vice president, a man Rockefeller and his allies deeply distrusted, became president. His name was Theodore Roosevelt. Hailing from the progressive wing of the Republican Party, Roosevelt was a force of nature, a charismatic and energetic reformer who believed the trusts had become too powerful. he unleashed the Department of Justice, filing dozens of lawsuits against monopolies under the Sherman Antitrust Act. He gained a reputation as the trust buster. At the same time, Rockefeller faced a new, devastating attack in the press. A journalist named Ida Tarbell, whose own father's oil business had been crushed by Standard, published a multi-part, meticulously researched exposé of the company for McClure's magazine. She laid bare the company's history of industrial espionage, price manipulation, and secret deals. For the first time, the public saw the inner workings of the machine. The articles were a sensation, and they infuriated Rockefeller, especially when the press began digging up the sordid details of his father's bigamous and criminal past. Standard Oil was now fighting a war on two fronts, one in the courtroom against the President of the United States, and one in the court of public opinion against Ida Tarbell. The golden age of the trusts was over. The day of reckoning was at hand. Theodore Roosevelt's trust-busting campaign was relentless. Standard Oil found itself drowning in lawsuits from federal and state governments. Rockefeller, the man who once commanded audiences with the world's most powerful figures, was now forced to dodge court summons, moving between his estates to avoid being served papers. In one high-profile case in 1907, a federal judge, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, fined Standard a staggering $29 million for accepting illegal rebate. The judgment was so enormous it sent shockwaves through the financial markets. Though it was later overturned on appeal, the message was clear. The government was no longer intimidated. When Roosevelt's term ended, Rockefeller supported the more conservative William Howard Taft to succeed him. He hoped for a reprieve. Instead, Taft, though temperamentally different, expanded the trust-busting campaign with even greater vigor. The final battle was inevitable. In 1909, a federal court ordered Standard Oil of New Jersey, the holding company for the entire empire, to be dissolved for violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. Standard appealed, fighting for its life all the way to the nation's highest court. Then, on May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States delivered its verdict. The 9 justices upheld the lower court's decision. The Standard Oil Trust, the largest and most powerful corporation on earth, was an illegal monopoly. It was given 6 months to disband. The empire Rockefeller had spent a lifetime building was to be broken into pieces. By the time of the breakup, Standard's dominance had already begun to fade slightly, but it still controlled an immense 70% of the refined oil market. Rockefeller formally stepped down as president. His shareholders received a proportionate stake in the 34 independent companies that were carved out of the monopoly's remains. These were the seeds of future giants: Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Conoco. And then, the ultimate irony occurred. The American public, now free to buy shares in these new, independent companies for the first time, rushed in. A feeding frenzy began. The stock prices of the baby Standards skyrocketed. The government's attempt to punish John D. Rockefeller had the opposite effect. It made him richer than he had ever dreamed. As the value of his diversified holdings exploded, his net worth soared past $1 billion. The government had broken his company, but in doing so, they had inadvertently made him the world's first billionaire. Flush with cash from this epic windfall, Rockefeller supercharged his philanthropy. In 1913, he created the Rockefeller Foundation, chartered with a mission to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. He would pour hundreds of millions of dollars into it, funding medical schools and eradicating diseases on a global scale. As he aged, Rockefeller turned over the management of his wealth and philanthropy to his only son, John Jr. Jr. was a different man from his father, more reserved, deeply pious, and haunted by the family's controversial reputation. He devoted his life to giving the Rockefeller money away, trying to sanitize the family name. But the family's dark past was never far behind. In 1913, Jr., as a director of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, supported the company's brutal efforts to break a miners' strike. In April 1914, National Guardsmen and private guards hired by the company attacked a camp of striking miners and their families. They opened fire and set the camp ablaze. Over 20 people were killed, including women and children, in what became known as the Ludlow Massacre. The elder Rockefeller, true to form, wholeheartedly supported his son's hardline stance. But Junior was horrified by the public outcry and the damage to the family's image. He began a long, difficult process of reforming labor relations and using foundation funds to support the miners' families. It was a painful lesson in the responsibilities that came with great power. 1 year later, in the spring of 1915, Laura Spelman Rockefeller, John's wife of over 50 years and his closest confidant, passed away. The widower endowed a foundation in her name with $74 million. When the United States entered the First World War in 1917, Rockefeller's image began to improve. He bought massive amounts of war bonds and used his foundation to support Allied causes. He noted the irony with grim satisfaction. Governments around the world were now encouraging the very oil firms they had broken up to work together, to create a cartel to supply fuel for the war. He had been a monopolist, but he had also been a man ahead of his time. In his final decades, Rockefeller retired to a winter home in Florida. He outlived all his old partners and rivals. He had a falling out with Henry Flagler, but only began to visit Florida after Flagler's death. He lived to see the prohibition of alcohol in 1920, a cause his Baptist faith supported, and then its repeal in 1933, pragmatically recognizing that it had created more problems than it solved. During the Wall Street crash of 1929, he lost nearly half his remaining wealth. But having weathered so many market cycles, he was undeterred. He saw it as a buying opportunity, acquiring 1 million shares of his old flagship, Standard Oil of New Jersey, at a bargain price. While the nation sank into the Great Depression, his son, John Jr., helped revive New York City's fortunes by financing the construction of the magnificent Rockefeller Center. The man once reviled as a secretive, ruthless monopolist transformed in his old age into a jovial public figure. He was famous for handing out shiny new dimes to children wherever he went. He had a stated wish to live to be 100 years old. He would fall just short. In the early morning of May 23, 1937, a few weeks shy of his 98th birthday, John D. Rockefeller died peacefully in his sleep. His body was taken by train to be buried in Cleveland, the city where his empire began. As his funeral took place, all the old Standard companies around the world stopped work for 5 minutes of silence. A final tribute to the man who created them all. John Davison Rockefeller was a giant of American industrial capitalism, the living embodiment of the Gilded Age. He was a man of profound contradictions. Shaped by a devout mother and a conman father, he was both one of history's most ruthless businessmen and one of its greatest philanthropists. His critics attacked him for his nefarious business practices and the secret arrangements that gave him an unfair advantage. Rockefeller always justified his actions as a necessary evil. Bringing order to an industry that was destroying itself, he never achieved a full monopoly, but his dominance was so complete that it forced the US government to fundamentally redefine the relationship between capitalism and the state. The legacy he left behind is as complex as the man himself. He not only built a company so large that it had to be broken apart, he established one of America's great business and political dynasties. His name lives on in the institutions he endowed and in the companies he created, which continue to fuel the world over a century later. So what are we to make of John D. Rockefeller? Was he a visionary industrialist who built the modern world, supplying cheap fuel that powered a new age of prosperity? Or was he a rapacious monopolist who used unethical methods to crush his competitors and bend the economy to his will? Perhaps the answer is that he was both. A man whose ambition was so vast, it could only be contained by the nation he helped to build. So what are we to make of John D. Rockefeller? Was he a visionary industrialist who built the modern world, supplying cheap fuel that powered a new age of prosperity? Or was he a rapacious monopolist who used unethical methods to crush his competitors and bend the economy to his will? The debate rages on, and this is where we turn it over to you. Share your final verdict in the comments section below. We read every single one. Your engagement is what fuels this channel. For more stories that explore the titans who shaped our world, please make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for watching.